All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining the meeting today. Hope everybody had a great weekend. Had a pretty good weekend myself. It's been busy the past few weeks. Hopefully, everybody's feeling a little bit of business increase with the rates kind of dropping down a little bit, or at least news of the rates, potentially coming down. I know I've been receiving a lot more phone calls from everybody, so I think starting to definitely pick up a little bit, and hopefully we'll start to see a nice swing in buyer activity here in the next upcoming quarters, basically is what I'm thinking. So, anyways, thanks for joining in. Today we're going to go over addendum versus amendment, which sounds kind of like I don't know, a silly topic, but actually I see a lot of stuff come over on addendums when they should have been on amendments and things like that. And, for a number of years, addendums were kind of what we always use to modify an agreement, but it's actually the incorrect form to use. And so I'll explain why and when to use which form. And then we'll touch on, well, more than touch on, but we're going to go over unrepresented buyers and listing brokers, basically how listing brokers can be working with unrepresented buyers. This is, it's not super common, but I have seen a little bit of an uptick from everyone with this. So we're going to talk about how to work with these unrepresented buyers. So let's go ahead and jump into it. If you have any questions, you want to speak live, raise your hand. Or go ahead and type them in the chat. I'm happy to answer as we go along. So let's start off with addendum versus amendment. What is the difference? So the meaning of addendum versus amendment. So if you were to look it up in thesaurus, I think it kind of helps us a lot. The addendum, synonyms for that would be addition, attachment, supplement. Synonyms for amendment would include change, modification, revision. So, I guess as you're going along in your transaction, you need to make a revision. You're going to want to use amendment. So if you're modifying the original purchase agreement and or counteroffers in any way, that's going to be an amendment. An addendum would be a supplement to. So usually, I'm seeing that used now when maybe you run out of space when you're writing up a request for repairs or something like that. That would be a supplement to. You're not necessarily modifying anything. You're adding to. You need more space, so on and so forth. So this kind of came about actually quite a while ago in 2017. CAR introduced the amendment of existing agreement terms. That's Form AEA. Even though this form has been around for almost 7 years now, we still see many seasoned agents using the addendum form. It's kind of like, you can't teach an old dog new tricks kind of thing, I guess. So those licensees out there that have been around for 15, 20 years, they're probably some of the biggest culprits I see of this. And some of them are out there training agents, newer agents, and they're saying, hey, just throw it on an addendum, and actually that's the incorrect form if it's a modification. So prior to 2017, almost everything within the CAR standard forms library, other than purchase agreement that was intended to be signed by a buyer and seller, was called an addendum, regardless of when it was introduced into the transaction. So these forms include, or but not limited to, extension of time addendum, backup offer addendum, additional signature addendum, short sale addendum, and addendum. The extension of time addendum actually got modified a couple revisions ago and is now an amendment, as it should be, because you're modifying the original terms of the agreement with some sort of extension on contingencies or close of escrow or something else. So that's actually now an amendment. The AEA was created to minimize the problem of uncertainty from parties who signed an addendum to propose a change only to have the other party not agree or refuse to sign or ignore the proposed change. The first line in the form identifies the AEA, the amendment form, as a proposal whose terms are specified in paragraph 1. So this would be what, the very top thing is. So this is a proposal to amend. So just because you're drafting this up doesn't mean the other party is going to agree to it. So this is designed to be in a proposal with a timeline on it, essentially. Paragraph 2 provides that the proposal, like an offer or counter, expires automatically unless accepted by the other party in the specified time, defaulting to 3 days after it's signed. So you treat it like a counter offer or maybe your request for repairs or something like that. It does have a default 3-day timeline for expiration, just like the offer does and other things. Um, if the receiving party takes no action, then the proposal terminates and the terms of the contract remain unchanged. With the automatic expiration language in the AEA, the party initiating the request can make a decision on how to proceed without waiting indefinitely for a response from the other principal. So when to use the addendum versus an amendment? In most cases, an addendum is intended to be attached to an offer or other document as it supplements the other document's terms. It is especially useful is if there's not enough space to write on all the terms to be added to an offer or other document. Although the text overflow addendum form TOA function in zip forms reduces the need to attach a general addendum to supplement an offer or other document. And I think sometimes we think maybe that TOA is not going to attach or it's just not working for some reason. And so it seems like some agents just kind of automatically default to, I'm just going to throw it on an addendum because I don't want to deal with that. And that's okay because it's a supplement to the document that you are um, sending over or drafting. So something you should note is an addendum is an open-ended offer that can be accepted anytime prior to its written withdrawal. So yes, if you're sending an addendum over to modify a contract, whatever it may be, instead of the amendment, which would be the proper form, if you're modifying the contract, you send over the addendum, there's no expiration date. So really the other party can sign it at any time until it is rescinded or withdrawn. So if you're sending an addendum instead of an amendment to modify the contract, be sure that you rescind that or you withdraw it after a certain amount of time. Otherwise, it just remains out there as a live document waiting to be signed by the other party. And you don't want them to agree to something all of a sudden. Maybe your negotiations take a turn and they're like, you know what, we are going to sign that addendum that you sent over. And maybe the seller didn't want that addendum now because things have changed with where you're at in the contract. Um, so I think that's one of the biggest reasons to really make sure you're using the correct form is because you don't want an open-ended document out there that could be signed at any time. An amendment is intended to be used after a contract has already been created and one party suggests a modification of the binding agreement. The AEA is a proposal and expires if not accepted. So if they don't accept it after a couple days, the other party, this thing's going to expire. It's no longer good. Even if they sign it, doesn't matter. It's expired. So just like a counter offer would be. So really, using the correct form when you're trying to make modifications or you're trying to negotiate a modification in your contract after it's already been created, use the amendment form. Some specific form examples, request for repairs. The RR is issued after an offer has been accepted, typically during the buyer's investigation period. Since it comes after an agreement, it is more like an amendment than an addendum. In December of 2021, expiration language was also added to the RR so that the seller does not respond in time the RR expires, having the effect of letting the buyer know that the requests have been rejected. So those also have a timeline. They're not open-ended on the form RR, which is a proposed amendment. So, and you'll see right here, the buyer proposes this request and it has the expiration date on it. This is a snippet down at the bottom of the RR form. So reminder from, I think last week or maybe the prior week, we did a webinar on contingencies and things like that. If a buyer proposes a request for repairs and the seller does not respond or is deemed revoked, the buyer must still perform on the RPA timeline terms with regard to releasing applicable contingencies or exercise their right to cancel. So that doesn't mean everything just stalls. Uh, the contingency timelines do not automatically extend in this scenario. So just quick reminder on that. We went over that last week when we did the request for repairs. Extension of time addendum, which is now extension of time amendment. After a few revisions ago, the ETA has pre-printed language to extend escrow or give buyer more time to remove contingencies. Here's your ETA, here's the top section, and it's pre-printed in there. You can see this is a proposal to amend the terms. So again, this is just a proposal. Just because you're sending it over doesn't mean the other party's going to sign it. This is, part of your negotiation toolbox. So comes pre-printed with extension of escrow, extension of contingencies. You're choosing one or both that you're trying to extend here, that you're proposing to extend with this amendment. Line 3 can be used to extend other timelines in a contract, such as maybe you have a SIP in place, a seller in possession. Maybe you need to extend the amount of time that the seller wants to remain in the property after it's already been agreed to. Remember, we already have a contract in place with timelines that have already been agreed to, so you're proposing to amend, and it could be the SIP, maybe the RPA, the BCO, any of the seller counter offers. If you wanted to extend expiration dates or anything, that could be a form to use with section 3. That's right here, other extensions, and you would just type it in and then what you're proposing the date to be extended to. Line 4 can be used as to propose additional terms to any or all of the extension terms proposed, such as maybe full or partial earnest money release, a release of EMD to the seller in exchange for extension of time. That's not too uncommon. It's usually what I do as a listing agent. If I have a buyer requesting more time, especially a close of escrow date or something like that, I always want something in exchange. And usually that's going to be partial or full earnest money release to my client, the seller. So if this was being proposed and they wanted to extend escrow or something like that, in the additional terms, I'm also going to want it to state that X amount of money is to be released to my seller in exchange for the extra time that you are requesting in this transaction. Or maybe additional per diem amount in an SIP, maybe you need to modify that. So an increase in the total rent or the per diem for extension of seller in time possession. So maybe, maybe the seller was requesting to stay in the property longer than originally agreed to. And you would state, for this, we're going to give you, instead of $100 a day, we're going to give you $150 a day. So that can be a way to use this extension form with either extensions and or additional terms. So, and that's down here on number 4. So pretty straightforward. If anybody has questions on it, obviously ask or throw it in the chat, but pretty straightforward stuff. Unrepresented buyers and listing brokers. So I think this is gonna we're gonna see more unrepresented buyers out there. I think for the most part, seems like everybody's getting along pretty good with the new changes. We're not seeing too much pushback with sellers still offering to pay buyer brokers and things like that. I've seen commissions kind of all over the place, some a little smaller. I've seen some actually longer. I see buyers agents asking for even larger commission amounts in some instances. So It's really kind of all over the map right now. It's still new for everybody. We're only, a month and a half into this. The new way of handling buyers, but there are some unrepresented buyers out there, and let's talk about how to deal with them as listing brokers and what we can and cannot do with them. So in review, we want to be sure we understand what it means to be working with a buyer. So there is a definition for us licensees on what it means to be working with a buyer. So the working with language is intended to distinguish MLS participants who provide full or limited brokerage representation or services for the buyer, including transaction brokerage, meaning, hey, I'm not really representing you so much. It's a limited service. I'm going to prepare these forms and things for you, but not much else. So this is going to include identifying potential properties, arranging for the buyer to tour a property, performing or facilitating negotiations on behalf of the buyer, presenting offers by the buyer, or other services for the buyer from MLS participants who simply market their services or just talk to a buyer, like at an open house, or providing an unrepresented buyer access to a house they have listed. If the MLS participant is working only as an agent or subagent of the seller, then the participant is not working with the buyer. In that scenario, an agreement is not required because the participant is performing work for the seller and not for the buyer. Authorized dual agents, on the other hand, work with the buyer and the seller, obviously. A written buyer agreement is required prior to a buyer touring a home. An MLS participant working with a buyer can enter into a written buyer agreement at any point, but must do so by no later than prior to the buyer touring a home. So this could change a little bit at an open house. So maybe an unrepresented buyer comes in and starts talking to you. Obviously, they've already toured the home at that point, but you will want to get your buyer rep agreement in place with them prior to them making an offer. So basically, as soon as practical. So in that scenario, it is a little different because the buyer has already walked into the home and toured it. And you at that time were working on behalf of the seller by allowing them to tour the home. But should they want to take things further, any of this stuff up here, starting to arrange financing, options and different things like that, or writing the offer, you're going to have to get that compensation agreement in place first. So now that the review is done, what is an unrepresented buyer? So a purchaser, excuse me, who acts without any real estate representation, either from the listing broker, which could be the agent who took the listing, or another agent in the listing brokerage firm, or another brokerage company. So can a listing broker refuse to present an offer from an unrepresented buyer? As a general rule of thumb, no, we have to present all offers to the seller. That's part of our fiduciary duty. The listing broker has a duty to the seller to present all offers received unless otherwise instructed in writing by the seller. So at the time of taking the listing, if you might think that, an unrepresented buyer is going to come in and maybe make an offer on their own or something like that, you would need something in writing in that listing agreement, or an addendum, an addendum to the listing agreement, stating that the seller does not want to review any offers from unrepresented buyers. So you would have to have that in the listing agreement. If the listing broker is uncomfortable proceeding in a transaction with an unrepresented buyer, the listing broker should discuss this with the seller at the time of taking the listing. Possibly the listing broker is concerned about additional work, time, effort, and risk that may result if the buyer is unrepresented, or that the transaction could possibly be more difficult, especially if the buyer is unsophisticated and inexperienced. So, this is a talking point with your listing presentations now. because we do have that section in the RLA now about, basically the extra work fee, the unrepresented buyer fee. Are you charging extra, or are you not going to accept offers, or, is the seller not going to accept offers from unrepresented buyers? So can a listing broker receive extra compensation if the listed property is purchased by an unrepresented buyer? And that is yes. That is C2, what we're looking at here, additional compensation to seller's broker if buyer is unrepresented. You can put whatever amount in you want in here. You're negotiating that with the seller. So having this discussion with them can help you negotiate this extra work number, essentially what this is. Maybe it's 0.5%, maybe it's, 1, 2, I mean, whatever you're negotiating with the seller at that point to deal with unrepresented buyers, it's going to go on C2 here. And you have to remember that this is only, that we're not talking dual agency here, where there has been some confusion with this, that you want to make sure you're being clear with your seller that this is not dual agency fee. This is unrepresented buyer fee, because if dual agency happens, you're going to need to put a compensation agreement in place with the buyer and ask for the seller to pay that compensation amount, just as if you were not a dual agent. So, yeah, this is not the dual agency fee. Agency is a consensual relationship that requires mutual agreement for the agent to represent the principal. The fact that a seller is paying the listing broker extra or not for a transaction involving an unrepresented buyer does not in itself create an agency relationship between the listing brokerage and the buyer. So just because there's extra compensation doesn't mean that there's agency. Those two do not go hand in hand. Paragraph C2 is an optional paragraph and will only apply if the box in the third column is checked at the time the listing is taken. The amount that the listing broker charges, if there is an unrepresented buyer, is up to the seller and the listing broker to negotiate. Whether 2C2 is checked, and regardless of the amount of compensation specified in 2C2, the listing broker is still entitled to the amount of compensation specified in 2C1 for representing the seller. So this number up here, whatever you're going to have in C1 that you originally agreed to for your compensation for services of representation for the seller, that's not going to change regardless. So it would be that plus the extra work fee is what I kind of call this. So why might a listing broker ask the seller for additional compensation if a buyer is unrepresented? Short answer is extra work and increased risk and liability. I mean, that's really what it boils down to for us as the licensees and the representative of the seller. An unrepresented buyer may likely make additional demands on the listing broker that would not be present if the buyer was represented, such as asking for forms, such as a purchase offer, allowing access to the property, interacting with escrow, title, and inspectors. All of these activities expose the listing broker to additional risk, but the listing broker may need to provide some of those services to facilitate the sale for the seller's benefit and thus fulfill the listing broker's fiduciary duty to the seller. So it's a little bit of a fine line here that you walk when you're dealing with the unrepresented buyer. And we all want to help and we all want to see the deals closed, but you really have to be mindful of the questions you're asking and the tasks you're performing. And is it a task on behalf of the seller, or are you creating agency with the buyer? So can a seller refuse to receive offers from unrepresented buyers? Yes. There's little incentive for a seller to do so. The offer may be professionally prepared by an experienced investor or poorly prepared by a novice purchaser. It is most likely in the seller's best interest to receive all offers, even those from unrepresented buyers, and decide on how to respond, if at all, to such offers on their merits, including taking into account that the buyer is unrepresented. So can a listing broker provide a purchase offer form to an unrepresented buyer? This is the question that's been coming up quite a bit, actually. Um, and the answer is yes, you can provide the purchase offer. I know that the security settings on zip forms, you can't just send them over a blank. You have to at least put in the property address. So you'll need to at least do that in order for for you to send over the blank purchase offer. Um, car terms, the car terms of use allow a broker to provide forms to any party in a transaction for which the broker is acting as an agent. The listing broker who does so should first get the permission of the seller, because again, you want to make sure that the seller's okay with what you're doing and that they are going to want to accept an offer or review an offer from an unrepresented buyer. So you do need to check and get permission of the seller, let them know, what needs to happen in order for them to, take a look at what this unrepresented buyer has to offer. To reduce the risk of creating an agency relationship with the buyer, the listing broker should not fill in any substantive terms or blank fields of the offer, but instead should only include the property address, the buyer's name on the form. You can also add in your brokerage information there on page 17 of the RPA, which I would definitely do, but there's not going to be anything on the buyer broker side, only on the listing brokerage side. So you will want to fill that out as usual on the purchase agreement, and then the buyer's name, and then the full property address. That should allow you to download that into a PDF and send it all over to the buyer and say, here's your offer form. Get it back to me when you can. So they will need to fill that out on their own, but we can provide them with the forms. We cannot advise them on the forms though. So let's see. If a listing broker gives an unrepresented buyer a blank offer, what else should the broker do or not do? So the broker should provide that buyer with a buyer non-agency agreement. And I would send that over either prior to sending over that blank offer. That's what I would do. But it at minimum, it should be included with that offer, because you want to make it so over the top clear that you are not representing these buyers in any way. I would have that signed first, and then once they sign and agree that, yes, you are not representing me, I am an unrepresented buyer, then send over the purchase package, essentially blank at that point. The broker should not discuss terms or help with the unrepresented buyer complete the offer. And I know we all want to help. That's what we do as realtors. We want to help homes get sold, and help buyers and sellers and get them through these transactions and everything else. But you also have to remember the risk and liability if you are not going to be actually representing them, So you need to make it very clear and draw that line, if they're choosing to be unrepresented for whatever reason, um, unfortunately, there's going to be some pains on their side. There are some ways that we can deal with that, though, especially if maybe this is their first purchase or something like that, and they don't know how to fill out this purchase form. We can do something for them with that as well. So the broker should remind the buyer that the broker is acting in capacity of a seller's broker only, with any further communications with the unrepresented buyer, and should refer the buyer to the previously provided BNA form. That's the buyer non-agency form. So these are the things that you should do. Now, let's say you provide them with the blank offer, and they go ahead and write it up, and the boxes are checked. It just has the price in there. Maybe no financing is checked. It's just, kind of a mess. How do you respond to that as a listing broker, right? So because you can't help them out with this. So the offer, so how do you respond? The offer should be evaluated on its own merits by considering the offer's terms and presentation. A relevant factor could include the fact that the buyer is unrepresented. The seller could decide to not respond at all, reject the buyer's offer. I would highly recommend to formally reject the offer in writing in the rejection spot, and point that out to the buyer if this is being rejected for whatever reason, just so it's clear with the unrepresented buyer that your offer has been presented and it's also being rejected, so they can't make any claims against you. The seller could accept the buyer's offer and they can issue a counter offer to the buyer's offer, the whole usual stuff here. If the buyer's offer is poorly written or does not contain terms approved by the seller, it may be best in the counter offer to reject the buyer's offer in its entirety and refer to and include with the counter offer a new purchase offer prepared by the listing broker on behalf of the seller with terms acceptable to the seller. So that's how you can kind of, I guess, combat a poorly written offer from a unrepresented buyer. Again, this is the extra work fee. This is the kind of stuff that you would be getting paid extra for, and what you need to discuss with your seller at the listing appointment. So it's a pretty good protocol. If there's just going to be way too many things to counter, just reject that, stated in the counter offer, you're rejecting it fully, and you're sending over an agreeable purchase agreement from the seller or on behalf of the seller. If the listing agent or another agent in the same brokerage company as the listing agent prepares an offer for the buyer, will that buyer be represented by the brokerage company? I think we know the answer to this. So if the agent for the brokerage company had previously obtained the buyer's signature on a buyer representation agreement, that's going to be BRBC and PSRA. Actually, I'd be curious, what are you using out there? Are you using more of the BRBC or are you using the PSRA? Because I personally kind of like the PSRA with the newer clients. I don't know what everybody's preference has been since it's rolled out, and the new PSRA form, the property showing agreement. But I'd be curious to see what you guys are using. What's your preference with the buyers that you're working with? So if the buyer has not signed a buyer representation agreement, either previously or prior to or concurrently with signing the offer, then an agency, if any, will be determined by the circumstances. If the agent preparing the offer merely provides the buyer with a blank form and also provides the buyer with a non-agency agreement, and the agency confirmation paragraph in the offer identifies the listing brokerage as the seller's only agent, then agency should be avoided and the buyer will be unrepresented. However, if the agent preparing the offer discusses terms with the buyer and assists the buyer in completing the offer, then a buyer could believe implied agency, if we all remember back to when we were getting licensed and learning about agency. The agent was acting on behalf of the buyer's behalf, and the agent could be deemed to represent the buyer. So you want to make sure you're not getting into this implied agency scenario by helping them fill out the offer and things like that. Really, it's it's a DMV transaction. Here's the form. Go fill it out and come back to us. For a refresher, implied agency definition. Implied agency is a relationship between a principal and an agent where the agent acts on behalf of the principal without a written agreement. It can be created by the actions of the parties involved or by law. So even though you're not providing the AD form or anything else, the mere action of helping the buyer fill things out and explaining things to them to hopefully make your job easier when presenting it to the seller. You're creating an applied agency, and more than likely, and now you're in an agency relationship with this buyer, and technically they're not unrepresented at that point. What would happen is essentially you're working for free at that point. The listing brokerage will then be considered dual agent in this transaction. Important: when the agent fails to obtain the buyer's signature on a buyer representation agreement, the broker and specific licensee will not be entitled to compensation from the buyer for the services rendered. The brokerage will be a gratuitous agent with the same responsibilities and liability to the buyer as a paid agent without the benefit of compensation. So the brokerage company will also not be entitled to additional compensation from the seller for having an unrepresented buyer, because technically they're not unrepresented at that point, and you can't get your extra work fee. So this all sounds, like maybe it won't happen, but we have to be careful, because these are the kind of things where lawsuits may come about more frequently, because the law can look at, well, were you acting as an agent or not? Did you create agency, implied agency, even with your actions with this buyer? And so you could have a dispute with your seller at that point too, with the extra work fee, because if you have a very savvy seller, and they know that you are helping the buyer, preparing things for the buyer and things like that, and you go and tack on that extra work fee, uh, the unrepresented buyer fee, they can dispute that and say, no, that wasn't an unrepresented buyer, because you were creating implied agency. You helped them along. You became their agent, and unfortunately now you're working for free as a buyer's agent and only getting paid your listing fee. So there could be a lot of scenarios that kind of come up from that. So you have to be very careful with agency now. And not that you weren't before, but now it is a little bit different, and we're going to have unrepresented buyers kind of running around out there, and we need to know how to work with them properly, so that we don't get ourselves into a situation where we're a gratuitous agent, or where we have created implied agency on accident for some reason. So yeah, that's any questions, any comments? What are you kind of seeing out there? That's what I have for today. It's a little short today, unfortunately. I thought it was gonna go a little longer, but I wanted to cover these topics, mostly the listing, working with unrepresented buyers, because we are starting to see that just a little bit more, and I've had some questions come up about working with them, and what can I and can't I do, as the listing broker. When am I working on behalf of the seller, and when am I creating agency with this buyer, as unrepresented buyer. So I wanted to cover that today, just because those questions coming in have been a little bit more frequent lately. So I wanted to be pretty clear from a CAR standpoint on what they're advising on how to handle working with unrepresented buyers. So I guess we'll wrap up a little early today. There's no other questions or anything. I don't see any in the chat. I appreciate everybody coming on, especially if you are a regular and you come on, every Monday. It really helps me out, because then I'm not answering the same questions that we just went over, usually like on a meeting and stuff. So I do really appreciate you when you join in. We had someone pop in. So Manny, open house this weekend, buyers asking questions about property. Does that create agency? If they're factual questions about the property, It doesn't, because you're working on behalf of the seller at that point. But if you start, um, you know, negotiating price with them and things in terms and stuff like that, then that's a little different. But if they're asking questions about the property, like, where does the yard end? Is it past that fence or not? Or is it over by that tree or something like that? You're still working on behalf of the seller at that point, so that would be okay to do. It's when you start basically negotiating terms and things like that for with the buyer on what the sellers will and will not take, as far as price and terms. Um, Another one, a lot of blowback and hesitation on the forms. And with so many buyers, it's hard to get those buyers forms signed. Um, Potentially, yes. And I received an email today from someone on our team that had an open house this weekend and said that there was a bunch of buyers that came in without their agents who said they hadn't signed anything, which is not advised at all. For one thing, you're going to lose your client if you do not have a buyer rep agreement in place with them and you're allowing them to just go and attend these open houses like you did before. You're going to lose your client because it'd be very easy for the listing agent to just say, hey, you haven't signed anything with anybody? Great. If you want to make an offer on this house, sign here. And boom, you just lost your buyer. So I do not recommend doing that. If you're having a hard time with the forms, we've had some previous sessions on this. One of them was with Jeff Lobb, where we went over scripts and different things like that, handling objections with getting these signed. It boils down to, and I've been saying this since forever, but especially since the beginning of this year when NAR settlement was really, really gaining steam and we were getting close to that. You have to show your value as a buyer's agent, if you're not showing your value, they're not going to sign this agreement with you. So you really have to know how to handle that. And if you actually read through the buyer rep agreement, it kind of explains things very well on what you're going to be doing. What are the expectations of the buyer working with you, and everything else. So there's some really good information actually in that form itself on presenting this to the actual buyers. Also, they came out with the buyer compensation agreement, advisory, not agreement, the BCA, another good one to, kind of read through, because that helps the sellers and the buyers understand how things work now. So they did create some forms for this. But if you're having a hard time, maybe check out that PSRA and just say, hey, we need to have a compensation agreement in place. This is only for this property that you're viewing with me today. And, if we find that we're incompatible to work with each other, then you can go about your merry way. But because I am doing work as a real estate agent for you on this particular property, if you were to buy this particular property, I would be entitled to compensation, for which I'm going to negotiate for you anyways with the seller. So you want to make sure that is very clear, that part of your negotiation of you negotiating the terms of the contract, the RPA, the purchase, part of those terms are you negotiating compensation from the seller to pay you and credit against what the buyer owes you. So that's part of the negotiation here as well. So, and a part of your service for them. So what else we have? When working with buyers under the new guidelines, do you recommend sign a buyer rep immediately, and for how long? By the way, nice to meet everyone. I'm new to Rise. So, hello, iPhone. So, when working with buyers under new guidelines, do you recommend signing buyer representation immediately, and for how long? This is going to be different on every scenario. I mean, it's like going to a listing appointment and you have maybe a very standoffish homeowner. Maybe they've had bad experience in the past, and they're like, there is no way I'm going to sign a 6-month listing agreement with you. I will give you 2 months to sell this home. take it or leave it. And you say, fine, I'll do a 2 month in hopes for an extension. It's the same thing or similar here with the buyers. I mean, if this is a brand new buyer, they found you through your marketing efforts, you've not known each other in the past, there's no relationship there. Yes, getting the buyer rep agreement signed right then can be a challenge, and that's why, or that's where the PSRA, the property showing agreement, might be a little more beneficial for you because it's a little less aggressive in my opinion. So, and that would probably be my preferred if it's someone I'm just starting to work with, their lead that came in, and I'm trying to develop this relationship with them. And that's even a little different now too. Before, you're just kind of talking, maybe showing a home here and there. And now you have to have a compensation agreement in place in order to tour the home. That's where I would probably break out that PSRA and say, look, happy to show you this home. In the eyes of the law that changed this year, I am working with you, and therefore I have to have a compensation agreement in place. It's only going to be for this home, and the other one we're going to see afterwards. And then after that, if we don't want to work together, then great. If so, we'll just continue, and maybe at some point you can get that BRBC signed. Another best practice that I've heard a lot of agents is not going for the full 3 months. I mean, the default timeline on the BRBC is 3 months now. Maybe you want to do it for a month to start out, and that's your pitch to them. Hey, let's work together for a month, a week, 2 weeks, whatever, and see how things go. If you like my service, then we can always extend. If not, then we could be on your merry way. It's also, you have to remember that it's a non-exclusive agreement in the beginning. That's what it's defaulted to. You can make it exclusive, which means, yes, at that point, you can send your clients out to the open houses and they're going to owe you compensation if they buy something, right? If you have an exclusive. But it's defaulted to non-exclusive, meaning you have to do work, which we just went over what is the definition of working with a buyer. You have to fall within that definition in order to obtain commission for that particular property. So if you have a non-exclusive buyer representation agreement in place, if you go and tour homes with them, they're going to owe you compensation if they purchase any of those homes. However, if they walk into an open house and love it and do not call you and sign a compensation agreement with the listing agent to purchase that home, you will not be entitled to compensation because you did not do work on that particular house. Now, did you introduce them to the house? Were you like, hey, there's an open house this weekend? Okay, now we're getting into working with the buyer a little bit. But if you just have them on, new property alerts from MLS or your CRM or your IDX or whatever, and they're getting new properties listed from you, and they're like, oh, this one looks cool, and they don't say anything, that's not working with the buyer. Automatic emails going out, stuff like that is not working with the buyer per their definition. So you have to actually do work in order to obtain, unless you have an exclusive. So I guess I don't know, I kind of rambled a little bit. Hopefully that answers that question a little bit, though. I think it's going to be a case by case scenario unless you have a very rigid process on how you intake buyers and work with people. And in that case, I'm going to guess you probably have more business than you can deal with, which is not a bad thing. But I think it's case by case. If they seem very standoffish, I might introduce that PSRA instead of the BRBC instead. Oh, hey, Sean. So that's who the new agent was. So thanks for coming on. Hopefully that answered your question there. If there's any other questions, throw them in the chat, raise your hand, and we can discuss as well. But I know it's still all new, and there are some challenges still, but I think for the most part, it seems like it's going over okay. At least the process of it is going okay. There is still some challenges, like Manny said, about getting buyers to agree to sign these compensation agreements. I think that that will lessen in time. A lot of this is still very, very new to the public. And, explaining these forms and getting someone to sign a buyer rep agreement when, we've been doing business for, however long you've been doing business. Um, you weren't using the buyer rep agreement because it was always, difficult to get them to sign it. This is something new for us too, and we'll get better at it with practice. There's a lot of resources out there. NAR, CAR both have a lot of resources, within their websites. They're pretty decent. Truthfully, YouTube, if you go on there, you'll probably find some coaches and things like that offering some free advice on what they're doing to get these agreements signed, best practices, handling objections, things like that. I would probably, if you're struggling, that's where I would go, is probably YouTube, and watch some of that stuff as well. If you're just still kind of struggling with your pitch, and see what other people are doing, and seeing what their successes are, because that can give you a shortcut on, you know, getting these things signed more effectively, rather than so much trial and error. Um, so yeah, if that's all we got, we'll go ahead and wrap up. If you have any questions, always give me a call, and hope everybody has a great week. I'll talk to you soon.